This is one of my favorite pictures of my brother Peter and me. We're seated at the table at my parents' house in Wausau, gazing into the camera, a study of in black, white, and gray. This is me. My hair is pulled back into two ponytails, framing my face. I look like a 60s folk singer. And to my left is Peter. His tan is offset by his crisp white shirt. And his smile is a little tight. His eyes behind his dark framed glasses are tired, almost blank. I don't know, maybe I'm just projecting my knowledge of what's to come onto his expression. Between us is a candle, its flame burning steadily, hopefully. But my favorite part about this picture is the large round homemade cake with two words on it: welcome home. There is a unique greeting among Vietnam vets that they say to each other when they get together. Whether they know each other or not, they say the same thing: welcome home, brother. When a soldier's remains are returned, sometimes after many years, his fellow vets will honor him at his funeral with the same greeting: welcome home, brother. The reason that they did this for each other is because nobody did it for them. When they returned home from their duties, there were no parades. There were no public displays honoring their service, no speeches. Returning members of the military, typically, whether Army or Navy, Air Force or Marine, were met with disdain by their fellow citizens. Why is that? First, there was this widespread belief that Vietnam was a wasteful exercise, unwinnable war. Then there were the nightly reports on the daily news that hurled the horror and heartache into America's living rooms. You see, Vietnam was the first televised war. But mostly, it was the reports, some true, some fabricated, that terrible atrocities were being committed in our country's name. President Nixon said that he wanted this war, in his words, to end with honor. Those newsreels just seem to mock that idea on a daily basis. But my brother Peter, he saw it all firsthand. And in his letters home, he wrote a harrowing story of his experience, sometimes in gruesome detail. In 1967, Peter was a student at UW-Madison, obtaining his bachelor's degree in journalism. Almost immediately after graduating, he received the dreaded letter from the draft board. And before he knew it, he was shipped off to basic training, first in Fort Dix, New Jersey, then in Fort Benning, Georgia. He adapted rather well to life in the military, which surprised my family because he was kind of a hellion when he was a kid. He loved to play practical jokes. One time at dinner, he would fill his mouth with mashed potatoes, and then he would squirt them out and yell, "I'm a zit!" So gross. My mom hated that. He was always making us laugh. When he was really young, he would bang on drums in the kitchen, and my mom would just go nuts over it because it was her saucepans. When he was a teenager, he would go and have beer parties and play pool with his buddies. And my mom hated that too, but mostly because he would come home smelling like fried food. But he also loved the outdoors. My dad was an avid hunter and fisherman, so Peter and I grew up on the water and in the woods. And having been a Boy Scout, he was better prepared than many for his time spent in the jungles of Vietnam. Although there's nothing that one can really do to prepare a person for that. The day before his 23rd birthday, he arrived at his base just north of Saigon. took a 22-hour flight via Hawaii and the Philippines. In his first letter home, dated July 25th, 1968, he wrote, "Vietnam is terrible. Everything smells like garbage, including your own body, because of the heat and humidity." He hated that kind of weather. Peter was assigned to Company A, 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, also known as the Triple Deuce. This was a mechanized unit, which means that they used armored personnel carriers, also known as tracks. When a patrol got caught in an ambush, helicopters, also called Hueys, would come in and try to airlift the injured men to safety. These were known as dust-offs because the rotors on the choppers would kick up so much dirt. It was Peter's unit who would go in with their tracks and try to rescue the men that the Hueys couldn't reach. Some of his descriptions of what he saw in combat are truly stomach-churning. The bloodshed was appalling. I remember in one letter, after a particularly gruesome encounter, he wrote, "Yesterday was by far the worst day of my life, and one I'll never forget." As company clerk, he was tasked with writing letters home for the soldiers who were killed in battle. I can only imagine that just burned those images even further into his mind. But he wrote dozens of letters home, too, of course. Dad was a friend of the publisher of the local newspaper in Wausau, and he got many of them printed. Years later, I met the woman whose job it was to edit out the offensive slang. But other than that, Peter's letters were published in full, a stark contrast to the nightly news. Oh, Peter had many terrifyingly narrow escapes in Vietnam. He was awarded the Purple Heart after being wounded in his leg. And in 1969, his tour finally ended and he came home to Wisconsin. He came back to the world. That's a phrase that our troops used in Vietnam to describe the United States. We were just so grateful that he was home. And that should have been the end of the war for him. But there are more casualties than those just on the battlefield. He tried to pick up his life by coming back to UW-Madison, where I was then enrolled, but he was met with so much hostility by his fellow students. He moved back to Wausau and started to work at a local TV station. And by that point, the early signs of his post-traumatic stress disorder became evident. PTSD. It wasn't well understood yet back then, and so his angry outbursts and bouts of depression went undiagnosed for a long time. That fun-filled kid who always used to make us laugh and taught me how to paddle a canoe, downhill ski, was gone. And in his place was a man who was haunted by demons that I can never understand. Eventually, he moved to Iowa, where he met other Vietnam vets that were able to help him face his struggles with PTSD. But by that point, another monster reared its head when he was diagnosed with cancer caused by Agent Orange. This is a chemical that our country sprayed throughout Vietnam to burn off that dense jungle foliage and caused untold misery to Vietnamese and Americans alike. My own husband, who was also a Vietnam vet, would be later treated for a different Agent Orange-related cancer. Peter's life, those last few years, were very tough. In and out of the hospital, long, painful treatments. And in 2004, our dad died. And Dad and Peter were really close. I remember when we sat down to write Dad's obituary, it was the first time in my life I saw Peter cry. Honestly, I think that he was crying as much for himself as he was for Dad. I think that deep down in his heart, he knew that his life was coming to an end, because just a few months later, after Dad had passed, Peter also died. I was going through his belongings and I found this locked box full of letters and tapes and films, some of which I don't think he was supposed to send home, and this trove of photographs. One, he was sitting next to his 13-year-old Vietnamese translator who was just casually smoking a cigarette. And another, he was standing in front of this scrawny little Christmas tree. And one, he was holding a captured enemy machine gun, his face slightly embarrassed but painfully young. I collected all of those items, letters, photos, and I wrote a book honoring Peter and his service in Vietnam. Woven among his letters were poems I had written, just desperately trying to make sense of it all. It became an expression of everything that I felt in my heart, everything that I wanted to say to him. And with it, I got one more chance to say, in those poignant words of Vietnam vets, "Welcome home, brother."